Yeah.
He loved me and everything that I was doing. It was sounding genuine to say he had dollar signs in his eyes. It wasn't like I felt like that, but I was very much encouraged.
He stole my money. That is what some of them said. And when you hear who said it and why, it will change the way you see one of the most celebrated men in professional wrestling history. Paul Heyman stood in that arena in 2024, and the whole building rose to its feet. Roman Reigns walked him to the Hall of Fame stage. Randy Orton stood up and bowed. Triple H clapped from his seat at the executive table. Cody Rhodes got emotional when Heyman mentioned his father, Dusty. Stephanie McMahon sat in the audience wearing an ECW hat. It looked like a coronation. It looked like the industry finally giving a man his flowers after a lifetime of relentless work and genuine brilliance. But somewhere in that crowd and somewhere beyond it, there were people who remembered a very different version of Paul Heyman. People who remembered waiting for checks that never cleared. People who remembered putting company expenses on their own personal credit cards because they trusted him. People who remembered being promised everything and ending up with almost nothing. How can one man be called a genius by some legends and a thief by others? That is the question, and it is the question we are spending the next several minutes trying to answer honestly. If you want more stories like this one, use the hype feature and give this video some hype. It helps more than you know, and it keeps these stories coming your way. Now, Paul Heyman has been called the greatest communicator in the history of professional wrestling. Roman Reigns said those exact words, not some internet fan typing from his bedroom, not a wrestling journalist filling a column. Roman Reigns, the man who held the WWE Universal Championship for longer than almost anyone in modern history. He said that without Paul Heyman, the tribal chief character simply does not happen. He said the moment he is no longer with the wise man is the moment he would stop appearing as the tribal chief entirely. That is how deeply Heyman is woven into the fabric of modern wrestling. That is the weight he carries in the industry right now. That respect is real. It is earned. Nobody handed it to him on a platter. But here is the problem with Paul Heyman. The same skills that built Roman Reigns also built ECW. And the same man who helped Roman become the most dominant champion of this era is the same man who left a locker room full of wrestlers without their money when the curtain came down. That has always been the conversation. That conversation never went away, not even on Hall of Fame night, not even with Randy Orton bowing. Let us go back to the beginning, before the wise man, before the advocate, before Smackdown, before ECW, before any of it. In World Championship Wrestling in the early 1990s, there was a loud, fast-talking manager by the name of Paul E. Dangerously. He was brash. He carried a mobile phone as a prop before most people even owned one. He was sharp and he had an eye for talent that nobody else in that organization could match. He did not just manage, he scouted, he studied, he planned, and he assembled something genuinely special. He called it the Dangerous Alliance. Arn Anderson was in it, Rick Rude was in it, Bobby Eaton was in it, Larry Zbyszko was in it, and for a meaningful period of time, so was a young, rough-around-the-edges brawler named Steve Austin. This was not a random collection of names. Heyman built it deliberately. He knew what he had. He knew what each man could bring, and he designed the faction around their strengths in a way that most managers in wrestling history have never been able to replicate. Arn Anderson has talked about that era with genuine pride. He described it as an assembly of the best performers in the industry, an eclectic mix of elite talent, people who could work any style, deliver any match, and make the audience believe. But Anderson was also completely honest about why the group never achieved everything it was capable of, and he was clear. He said the failure was not in the talent, it was in the booking. WCW management at the time was producing what Anderson openly called shitty and sporadic booking. No matter how hard a soldier in the field performs, Anderson said, they cannot outrun incompetent command above them. That framing tells you something important about Paul Heyman that will come up again and again in this story. He has always been ahead of the room. His ideas were consistently sharper than the structures built around him. His vision was cleaner than the corporate machinery trying to contain it. And in WCW, that just meant frustration and missed opportunities. The Alliance had the talent to be legendary and fell short, not because of anything Heyman did wrong creatively, but because the company around them refused to follow through. That dynamic would repeat itself, always in different ways, but always recognizably the same. What Heyman did in the Dangerous Alliance era was give performers a kind of protection they had never had before. Rick Rude was a main event caliber star, legitimate, physically imposing, psychologically sharp in the ring. Under Heyman's vocal shield, Rude could focus entirely on what he did best between the ropes and leave everything else to the man with the phone. There was an authenticity to that pairing. Rude did not need someone telling him what to say. He He needed someone willing to say everything he did not have to. Hayman filled that role completely and then some. That combination of physical performer and brilliant verbal strategist was not an accident. Hayman understood early on that the most effective pairings are built on contrast. The man who lets his body do the talking needs a partner who can make words feel like weapons. That is the model he would return to over and over again throughout his career with different performers in different eras, and it would produce the same results every time. The 1992 War Games match, with the Alliance fully assembled, is still remembered today as a high watermark for faction psychology in professional wrestling. It was proof that when you put the right people together and give them a clear purpose, the audience will follow you anywhere. You could feel the coherence of the group. You could feel that every person in that steel structure understood exactly what they were doing and why. That feeling does not happen by accident. It comes from a leader with a clear vision who communicates it so well that everyone around him absorbs it completely. And then there was Austin. The Austin story is the one that gets told most often when people try to explain Heyman's gift for recognizing talent before anyone else does. Steve Austin has been completely clear about what Hayman meant to him at that specific point in his career. When WCW released Austin, Hayman called him immediately. Not after taking a few weeks to think about it, not after someone else recommended it. Immediately, he offered Austin a platform in ECW. He told Austin that ECW was a place where he could find himself, sharpen his character, and figure out exactly who he was going to be. And Austin has said that what he learned from Rick Rude and Paul Heyman during that period taught him an immense amount about the professional wrestling business, about psychology, about how to present yourself to an audience, about how to make people in an arena feel something genuine. Heyman was one of the first people in the entire industry to see what Steve Austin could become. Sit with that for a moment. Before Stone Cold, before the catchphrases, before the beer truck and the glass breaking, and the rattlesnake who became one of the most commercially successful performers in wrestling history. Paul Heyman made a single phone call and opened a door that changed everything. That is the genius side of this man, and it is not a myth. Nobody who was there disputes it. But now let us move to Philadelphia, because that is where the story breaks open in ways that still hurt people today. Extreme Championship Wrestling was Paul Heyman's entire soul poured into a wrestling company. It was his vision given physical form. He took a small regional promotion based out of a bingo hall and turned it into a cultural revolution that shook the entire industry. The hardcore style, the boundary-pushing characters, the edgy storytelling that went places WWE and WCW were simply too cautious to touch. ECW became the most talked about promotion in professional wrestling, even though it never had the financial resources or the television reach of the two major companies. It ran on passion, it ran on belief, and it ran on Paul Heyman's ability to make everyone around him feel like they were part of something that mattered. Rey Mysterio arrived in ECW as a 20-year-old. He was just a kid from Tijuana with a style that American audiences had never seen. And before his very first match in that building, he turned to Hayman for guidance. Hayman did not hand him a match layout. He did not give him a list of spots to hit. He asked him a question. He asked, "If God told you that if you blow me away with your performance tonight, your family gets into heaven with you, what match would that be?" That question, that reframing of a wrestling match as something with spiritual stakes, that is pure Hayman. He was not managing a wrestler that night. He was giving a young man a reason to transcend himself. And Mysterio and Psychosis went out and introduced a style of lucha libre to American audiences that fundamentally changed what people believed a small man could accomplish in a professional wrestling ring. That match did not just impress people, it shifted the entire conversation about what kind of wrestling was possible. That was Paul Heyman operating at his absolute best. That was his real gift. He found that same depth of purpose in the Tommy Dreamer and Raven rivalry. He took their genuine shared history from before professional wrestling, their real backgrounds together, and wove it into a story that ran for years and included a childhood grudge and a love triangle with Beulah McGillicuddy. It was not a feud. It was a full serialized narrative with emotional weight that kept building. And Dreamer bought in so completely that he lost to Raven dozens of times without winning a single match across their entire rivalry. That level of loyalty to a storyline is nearly impossible to create artificially. You have to earn it from the performer. And Hayman earned it through a combination of real creative brilliance and what can only be described as a silver tongue that could make you believe in almost anything he told you. Consider what that took on Dreamer's part. Week after week, show after show, he was performing in front of a passionate crowd that wanted him to win, and he never did. Most performers in that situation would eventually push back, ask for something, demand a resolution. Dreamer stayed because Hayman had convinced him that the journey itself was the point, that losing was building something bigger than any single victory could. And eventually, of course, it did. The payoff, when it came, landed harder than it ever would have if Dreamer had simply won early on. Hayman understood unfolded story in a way that most people in professional wrestling have never come close to grasping. And that is precisely the problem. A silver tongue is also a tool of manipulation. When ECW filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2001, the company was carrying nearly $7.5 million in total debt. Of that sum, nearly $500,000 was owed directly to talent and staff. The people who took chair shots and barbed wire bumps and drove hours through the night to perform in small buildings and put ECW on their backs every single week. Those people were owed their money, and when the company closed, they did not get it. Bubba Ray Dudley has described in detail what it felt like to be on the inside of ECW as the money dried up. He talked about Hayman waiting until the absolute end of every show to hand out checks, waiting until the building had emptied, waiting until the wrestlers were exhausted from performing and just wanted to go home, because he was hoping people would take the check without looking too hard at it and leave without asking any difficult questions about their pay. That is not a misunderstanding between business partners. That is a deliberate tactic. That is a man who knew the numbers were not good and was doing whatever he could to delay the conversation show by show, week by week. Devon Dudley went even further in his assessment of the root cause of ECW's collapse. Devon said plainly that Hayman refused to delegate. He said Hayman carried too much responsibility on his own. He trusted no one around him with any real authority to help run the business properly. And eventually that accumulated weight burned him out completely and forced the doors shut. Devon was not just criticizing the outcome of the bankruptcy. He was naming the specific character flaw that he believed made the collapse essentially inevitable. Hayman could not let go of control, not even a fraction of it. Not even when holding on to it was killing the company he had built from nothing. The people who paid the price for that were the ones who had given everything. Rob Van Dam is one of the most widely discussed cases from the ECW financial collapse. RVD was one of the most beloved performers on that roster. The fans worshipped him. His matches drew enormous reactions. And when everything ended, Rob Van Dam was owed nearly $200,000 in back pay. That is not a minor accounting discrepancy. That is a life-altering sum of money for a performer at that stage of their career. And yet Van Dam remained what he himself called a Paul Heyman guy. He acknowledged the debt publicly. He did not pretend it did not exist, but he also did not let it fully shatter their relationship or turn him into someone who only had bitter things to say. That complicated loyalty, the ability to hold the anger and the gratitude at the same time, is something you see again and again with the people Hayman built. Even when you know you were shortchanged, the experience created something in you that was hard to just abandon. Chris Candido is a different story entirely. His experience stands as perhaps the most damaging individual account from the ECW era. Candido was reportedly persuaded to use his personal credit card to cover ECW company travel expenses. Think about what that means in practice. You are not just trusting your employer to pay you back. You are staking your personal credit rating, your financial stability, your family's financial health on the promise that the company you work for will honor its commitments. And then the company went under. Candido reportedly had to sell his home. He had to use his own money to pay back creditors for costs that were never his responsibility in the first place. The figure associated with those travel costs is close to $170,000. And when Candido then went to Hayman seeking his legitimate back wages for the money he was simply owed for the work he had performed, the situation allegedly deteriorated further. Hayman is said to have gone out of his way to damage Candido's professional reputation backstage. And when Candido wanted to move on, to go work for someone else and try to rebuild what had been taken from him, he was reportedly told that getting his contract release would require him to sign away his legal right to pursue the money he was owed. You want your freedom? Then give up the claim. That is not a business dispute. That is leverage applied to someone who was already financially destroyed by trusting you. Those are the receipts. Those are the specific stories. And that is why the phrase, "he stole my money," does not feel like an overstatement to the people who actually lived through it. Now, Taz offers an interesting counterweight to the harder ECW stories. Not every relationship with Hayman ended in bitterness and unpaid invoices. Early in Taz's ECW run, there was genuine real friction between the two men. Not scripted tension for the audience, actual tension. And Hayman, being the operator that he is, used that authentic friction as part of the product. He leaned into the real hostility and made it serve the show. But over time, the relationship evolved. When Taz was dealing with significant injuries and could not perform, Hayman reportedly honored a handshake deal to continue paying him. No written contract to enforce, just a verbal commitment, and he kept it. That matters to the overall picture. That complicates the narrative in an important way, because not everyone who spent time in Paul Heyman's world walked away feeling robbed. Some walked away feeling genuinely taken care of, and that is the most difficult part of this story to sit with. If Hayman were simply a villain, this would be easier to process. He is not simply anything. He is a man capable of honoring an unwritten promise to one person while allegedly allegedly destroying another person's career for having the nerve to ask for money that was rightfully owed to them. Both things are true simultaneously. The kindness and the betrayal existed in the same person, sometimes in the same season, sometimes in the same organization. That version of Hayman, the one who burned people in Philadelphia, eventually found his way into WWE. And once he was inside a company with real financial infrastructure and a proper payroll department, something remarkable happened. He looked like an entirely different kind of genius, a clean genius, an uncomplicated one. The Smackdown writing team in 2002 became his next laboratory. He was the lead creative voice for the brand, and he had access to 6 performers who could do things that almost nobody else in professional wrestling could do at that time. Edge, Rey Mysterio, Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Chavo Guerrero, what became known as the Smackdown 6. Edge has spoken about what Hayman brought to that creative period with genuine warmth. He said Hayman simply realized he had 6 performers who could crush it in any combination you could imagine. That was the entire creative philosophy. Mix and match. Throw them together in different pairings. Give them the freedom to experiment with things they had never tried before. Trust the performers and let them rise to the level of the opportunity. And what followed was something remarkable. Free television matches on SmackDown regularly surpassed pay-per-view level quality. The Blue brand became appointment viewing not because of bombastic storylines or celebrity appearances, but because the in-ring work was genuinely the best in the world. There is something worth saying about Kurt Angle's place in that era. Angle was already an Olympic gold medalist. He was already a decorated WWE champion, but the SmackDown 6 environment pushed him into combinations and story contexts that he had not explored before. Heyman's willingness to put Angle opposite Rey Mysterio, to put Edge alongside Guerrero, to create pairings that had no obvious logic on paper but produced extraordinary television, was the defining creative instinct of the period. He was not booking to a formula. He was running genuine experiments and trusting his instincts about what would work. Edge described his partnership with Rey Mysterio during that period as the product of mad scientist thinking. They executed complex spots inside a WWE ring that simply had not been attempted before. And they did it on free television because Hayman created an environment where experimentation was encouraged rather than treated as a risk to be managed. Eddie Guerrero's entire trajectory toward the WWE Championship runs directly through Paul Heyman. Heyman had been an advocate for Guerrero since their overlapping time in ECW in Mexico, identifying his main event potential well before the wider industry was ready to agree. And when Heyman was in the SmackDown general manager role, he entered an on-screen feud with Guerrero, deliberately using his own heel persona to help elevate Guerrero's standing as a beloved figure. He put the heat on himself so someone else could benefit from it. He understood that his job was not to be the star. His job was to make the show work and to make the people around him look as good as possible. That is the version of Paul Heyman that performers defend without reservation or qualification. And it is real. The Brock Lesnar partnership is a different kind of legacy. It is the most enduring professional relationship in Heyman's career, and also the one that most clearly illustrates his strategic instincts at their finest. Brock arrived in WWE in 2002 and immediately created friction with veterans who resented how quickly he was being elevated. He was young, he was physically dominant in a way that was almost unfair, and he was being pushed faster than almost anyone in company history. Some veterans tried to fill his ears with bad advice. Taz was the one who stepped in and told Lesnar to stop listening to the noise and listen only to Paul Heyman. That single piece of guidance changed the course of Lesnar's career. Brock Lesnar himself has described the partnership in the simplest possible terms. He said Heyman is the best talker in the business. He said he himself is the best at everything else. That is not arrogance. That is an accurate description of how the arrangement functioned. Heyman spoke for Brock because Brock did not need to speak. The physical presence, the genuine danger that Lesnar radiated in a professional wrestling ring communicated everything that words might otherwise need to say. Heyman just provided the language around what the body had already stated. The strategic genius of the Lesnar partnership was built on the idea of scarcity. Heyman argued consistently that presenting Lesnar on television every single week would devalue the brand. He believed that the less frequently you see something truly extraordinary, the more valuable each appearance becomes in the eyes of the audience. And he was proven right. By managing Lesnar's appearances carefully and keeping him off television for extended periods, every single return became a genuine event. Every match carried authentic weight and consequence. That positioning helped Lesnar maintain his status as wrestling's ultimate final boss for over 2 decades, which is a feat almost without precedent in the modern era of the business. The single most shocking moment of that partnership came at WrestleMania 30 when Brock Lesnar ended The Undertaker's undefeated streak at the event. That streak had stood for over 2 decades. It had become the defining sacred myth of professional wrestling. No one believed it would end. And when it did, the arena arena fell into a silence that no one who was there has ever fully been able to describe. Grown men sat motionless. Children cried. The commentary team could barely form sentences. And Hayman stood in the ring with the man who had just done the impossible and delivered a promo that reframed everything the audience had just witnessed. He took the most shocking moment in wrestling history and immediately began turning it into the cornerstone of Lesnar's permanent mystique. That is what Hayman does. He does not just react to moments. He absorbs them and weaponizes them on behalf of whoever he is standing next to. He finds power, he attaches himself to it, and then he helps that power feel completely unstoppable. That is the Hayman pattern. He does not just assist stars. He embeds himself so deeply into their professional identity that the star begins to feel incomplete without him. Roman Reigns said it out loud. He said the moment he is no longer with Hayman is the moment he stops being the tribal chief. That is a world champion publicly stating that his entire on-screen identity is co-created by his manager. Roman said it as a tribute. He meant it with real sincerity and pride. But hold that image for a moment. Think carefully about what that kind of dependency means professionally. Think about how difficult it becomes to operate independently when someone else is that woven into how you understand your own value. The same skills that build stars can also, over time, bind them. The Roman Reigns chapter is genuinely impressive creative work by any measure. The tribal chief character launched in 2020 and immediately became the most compelling character in professional wrestling. A dominant champion who ruled through fear and through family obligation. A man who demanded public acknowledgement from everyone in his orbit, and at the center of the entire structure was the wise man, the strategist, the one who shaped every word with surgical precision and understood exactly when to speak and when to say nothing at all. Roman has repeatedly said that Hayman is the greatest communicator of all time, a man who knows exactly what to say and precisely when to say it to get the maximum response from any audience. And the results made the argument for him. Roman's championship reign became the most dominant of the modern era. The Bloodline story became the most analyzed and most discussed storyline in professional wrestling in years. Hayman also used this period to help shape the next generation of the Anoa'i family, Solo Sikoa, the new iteration of the Bloodline, the constant evolution and disruption of the faction's internal politics. Hayman has described the creative approach as a disruption of the disruption, always moving forward before the story has a chance to feel comfortable or settled. Now place that alongside ECW. In ECW, Hayman was also the sole architect of everything. He controlled the characters, he shaped the stories, he held all the creative authority in his own hands. It produced brilliant television, and it produced financial catastrophe off-screen. The same refusal to delegate that Devon Dudley identified as fatal to ECW was present in the Bloodline era too. The difference was that inside WWE, there is an entire corporate infrastructure designed to absorb those tendencies before they reach the talent. The institution that Hayman spent years opposing ultimately became the thing that protected everyone around him from the version of Hayman that burned people in Philadelphia. The institution saved him from himself. April 2024, the WWE Hall of Fame ceremony in Philadelphia. And yes, the city mattered. The building was in Philadelphia, ECW's city, the city where Hayman had built something extraordinary and then watched it burn. The first Hall of Fame class selected by Triple H, following his assumption of full creative control of the company, and Hayman was the headliner. Roman Reigns walked to that stage as Hayman's inductor, the tribal chief acknowledging the wise man who helped make the tribal chief. The poetic symmetry of it resonated through the entire room. Roman spoke about Hayman's contribution to his career without any of the usual professional distance. He acknowledged the wise man openly and completely. He said the things out loud that most performers would leave unspoken, and that in itself was a measure of how much Hayman had given him. Randy Orton stood up and bowed. Not polite applause, a deliberate, specific bow. That is a man communicating something more than simple approval. That is a legend acknowledging someone he places at a different level of respect. Cody Rhodes had a moment that evening that cut through all the professional theater. When Hayman referenced Dusty Rhodes during his speech, Cody responded with a heartfelt thank you that needed no elaboration. Whatever professional complications existed between the two of them, whatever history the business had put between them, that moment reduced everything to something far more human and real. Triple H took pointed jokes during the speech and stood and clapped anyway. And Hayman used that platform to declare himself a Paul Levesque guy. That declaration was a significant public endorsement. It came after the turbulent and complicated transition away from Vince McMahon. It was Hayman saying clearly in front of the entire industry that this new era was the right direction and that he was fully aligned with it. Stephanie McMahon sat in that audience wearing an ECW hat, the daughter of the man whose company had absorbed and ultimately outlasted what Hayman built, wearing ECW gear in homage. Hayman joked that she had married the wrong Paul. The room laughed. But the image of that hat in that venue told a story that did not need a punchline. Jim Ross, one of the most respected voices in the history of professional wrestling commentary, has described Heyman as a professional heat seeker, sharp, skilled at reading a room, but also someone who keeps everyone around him perpetually wound up. That observation captures something essential about how Heyman operates at his core. He does not just understand tension, he generates it, he requires it. And when that tension is directed into creative work, it produces some of the best television in the history of professional wrestling. But tension does not stay contained to the screen. It flows into every relationship it touches, into financial decisions, into the long silences that follow years after the promotion has closed. The question at the center of Paul Heyman's career is one nobody can answer cleanly or with full confidence. Is he a genius who did what he had to do to keep his dream alive for as long as possible? A man who delayed filing for bankruptcy for 90 days specifically so that the final checks he wrote could not be recalled by creditors once the filing was processed? A man who honored a verbal agreement to continue paying an injured performer when he had no legal obligation to do so? A man who made legitimate stars out of people nobody else believed could be stars? Or is he a promoter who left people holding the bag when it counted most? A man who used other people's personal credit, other people's unpaid wages, and his own considerable persuasive abilities to fund a vision that ultimately served his legacy more than it served the people who built it alongside him? A man whose refusal to share control made the collapse of ECW not just possible, but essentially unavoidable from early in its history? And there is a third question embedded inside those two that is harder to ask. Does the quality of the creative work justify the human cost? Does the fact that ECW changed professional wrestling, that it gave WWE the blueprint for the Attitude Era, according to Jim Ross and many others who were there, does that legacy belong to the performers whose money was never returned? Because without Rob Van Dam and Tommy Dreamer and Chris Candido and the Dudleys working for below their worth and sometimes for nothing at all, ECW does not become the cultural institution it became. The legacy that Heyman claims, and that has earned him a Hall of Fame induction, was partially constructed on the unpaid labor of people who never saw full compensation for their contribution to it. That question does not have a clean resolution. It just sits there, and it deserves to be acknowledged. The honest answer, the only defensible one, is both. That is the uncomfortable truth that the legends themselves have arrived at across decades of reflection. Tommy Dreamer, who reached the darkest point of his life in the aftermath of ECW's end, eventually found genuine forgiveness and genuine gratitude. Bubba Ray, who told the story about checks being handed out at the end of shows, still calls Heyman a friend. Rob Van Dam, who was owed nearly $200,000, remained a Paul Heyman guy by his own description. These are not naive or easily fooled men. They have not forgotten what happened. They are choosing to hold two conflicting realities at once because that is the only intellectually honest way to hold Paul Heyman as a figure. The visionary who asked Rey Mysterio what match he would perform to earn his family a place in heaven. The business operator who convinced Chris Candido to put company travel on his personal credit card and then allegedly blocked him from moving on when he simply asked for it back. The man who gave Steve Austin a genuine lifeline when every major company in America had finished with him and thrown him away. The man who Devon Dudley sincerely believes destroyed his own creation through sheer unwillingness to trust anyone else with any meaningful part of running it. The wise man who helped Roman Reigns construct the most dominant and uninterrupted championship reign of the modern era. The promoter who stood at the back of late-night venues handing checks to tired and beaten-up wrestlers and hoping they would just go home before looking too closely. All of it is true. All of it at once. Every single word. And that is what makes Paul Heyman one of the most compelling and most morally complicated figures this industry has ever produced. The 2024 Hall of Fame induction was not the erasure of those older stories. It was the industry making peace with the idea that both versions of Paul Heyman are real and that both versions belong to the same historical record. The Hall of Fame is not a pardon. It does not resolve the financial grievances. It does not hand back the money owed to the ECW locker room. It is a recognition. And in this case, it recognized a full portrait, scars and all. Heyman himself initially resisted accepting the induction. When he finally accepted, he pointed to what Triple H had built as the reason. He praised the new creative philosophy. The idea that the era of forcing performers into a single predetermined mold was over, that the new direction was about finding and amplifying who each person authentically was. That philosophy is the one Heyman has always claimed to operate by. Finding the hook, finding the truth, building around it. He wore his ECW gear to the ceremony. He stood in a WWE Hall of Fame and represented the company that WWE absorbed and the era that WWE spent years quietly borrowing from. He said what he had built in Philadelphia Philadelphia was the DNA of the multi-billion-dollar company he was now being celebrated by. He said it without apology. Whether you believe that framing depends entirely on which version of the ECW story you give more weight, that is Paul Heyman. The 2024 Hall of Fame got one thing exactly right. This is a man whose story demands to be told completely. Not just the genius parts, not just the debt, everything together. Because taken separately, neither version of Paul Heyman is actually the truth. The truth is, in both of them, existing simultaneously inside the same person for the same 30-year career. The legends built his legacy with their testimony, the praise and the pain both. Some of them spoke at his induction ceremony, and others were processing old wounds in interviews somewhere far from Philadelphia. All of them were telling true stories about the same man. And if you have made it to the end of this video, you are now holding the full picture. You know why some men stood and bowed and why others are still waiting to feel fully whole. Tell us in the comments, whose story hit you hardest? Was it Dreamer? Was it Candido? Was it RVD, still proudly calling himself a Paul Heyman guy despite nearly $200,000 in unpaid wages? Drop your answer below. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one. There is plenty more coming your way.